Hi there YouTube, back here again with another showcase of my vinyl collection, and today I wanted to do a video focusing on the all of the stuff in my collection from the punk rock subgenre known as emo. And I feel like I have to preface this video first by saying it's been a while since I've made one of these, and that is not uncommon for something I say at the beginning of these videos because I rarely make videos. But having looked at my numbers and my view count on some of my last vinyl videos especially, I've noticed that, you know, it's nothing to... God, I can't make an emo reference this early on. It's nothing to write home about, my numbers, but it's... you know, for stuff I've done on YouTube, done fairly well. There seems to be some amount of interest in it. I get comments every now and then, so I wanted to continue on with this vinyl collection series. And I also wanted to specifically focus on the emo subgenre because I feel like I've looked at videos online. I've tried to look them up. I've tried to see what other people out there have collected, and unfortunately, considering that YouTube is simultaneously one of the only places online where you can listen to the rarest singles and vinyl-only releases and limited edition stuff, and, you know, super independent, super rare, super obscure emotive hardcore records that came out in the late 80s, early 90s. It is also simultaneously the only place that, you know, if you just look up the word emo, mostly what you're going to find is a lot of these parody videos or comedy videos of, you know, the emo cringe compilations or whatever, where it's, you know, teenagers with crazy polka dot spotted hair and fluorescent purple makeup, you know, joking around about cutting themselves and stuff that I feel has absolutely zero to do with the genre as I know it, and zero to do with the music that I'll be showing here. So just a little primer. Most of the stuff is all of this is on vinyl, and most of this music is not going to resemble much of what you maybe heard associated with that word if you're not here specifically to find emotive hardcore. If you're here to find sort of the Fall Out Boy, Panic at the Disco, My Chemical Romance strain of the genre, you are going to be sorely disappointed by this video. But if you want to know a little bit about the genre's history, a little bit about some of the more satellite bands around, sort of the influence of where it came from, and some of the records that were released at that time in the late 80s, early 90s, that's mostly what I have to show here. And I specifically find this genre to sort of be fascinating, both this and sort of early 90s post-hardcore, of which emo was a subset of. I find to be really fascinating because it's sort of an invisible history. You know, a lot of people talk about 70s punk rock, a lot of people talk about 80s American hardcore, and then they just skip right over to Nirvana and alternative rock in the 90s and then kind of go from there. But, you know, while Nirvana and all that stuff was happening, there was still a very thriving post-hardcore underground that was going on, and, you know, the stuff that was happening in the 80s still had a timeline that was continuing through into the 90s, and a lot of these bands that I'll be showing in this video have more to do with that. So enough preamble, too much preamble probably, but let's go ahead and get into first my 12 inches or my LPs, and then we'll show you the singles and EPs. So here we go. Now some of these I've shown in my post-hardcore video because, like I said, the genre emotive hardcore, or later shortened to emo, was a subset of post-hardcore. So a lot kind of can be classified as both. And if you want to go back and watch that video, you know, I might describe some of those records in a slightly different way. But here is from Discord Records, 1986, is Can I Say by the band Dag Nasty. Brian Baker, who was first the bass player of Minor Threat, kind of started this band with lead singer Dave Smalley, who was a singer for the Boston hardcore bands before joining this band in DC. This is their first LP. They later went on to make a lot of other music, and they had many different singers, but this era with Dave Smalley really encapsulates everything that emotional hardcore was about in DC in the mid-'80s, which is this kind of frenetic, angst-ridden, melodic hardcore. Very similar to like bands like Rites of Spring and Embrace. And I think this band is a little bit punkier than those bands. A little bit. All of those bands are punk bands, but this one I think still holds a little bit to that sort of early DC sound. But if you listen to the lyrics, obviously the lyrics are a lot more introspective than traditional hardcore, and there's a little bit more melody. A lot of this really just sounds a lot like Embrace, to be totally honest. But I think this is a better record than Ian Mackay's spin-off band Embrace, which was cited as one of the first emo bands. I think this record's better, and I think the songwriting is better. And Dag Nasty later went on to change their sound quite a bit, but I think this is still the most interesting thing they ever did. Almost 7 minutes into this, and I've only showed one record. Alright, moving up the timeline quite a bit, we have Still Lifes from Angry Heads with Skyward Eyes. This is a 2-album set. This is a double album. This is released by Ebullition Records. I want to say 92, 93 maybe. I found this at Amoeba Records in Hollywood. This was a really exciting find because this is not a repressing or anything like that. And Ebullition, they put a lot of work into their record releases for an indie label in the early 90s. They, essentially just focused on hardcore and post-hardcore and emotive hardcore. This album, I guess, has a little bit of a backstory that's sort of interesting. I'll try not to go into it too much. There was a famous punk zine at the time called Maximum Rock and Roll, and yes, Maximum Rock and Roll, and there was they kind of put down the law at one point and said, we're not going to review all this newfangled post-hardcore because it's not quote-unquote punk enough. So even back in the early 90s, there was a lot of derision thrown at some of these subgenres. And this was one of the albums that they refused to review, and that actually kind of propelled interest in the album within the underground punk world. And another magazine that was ran by, I think, the same people who run Ebullition, you can go back and fact check me on that, called Heart Attack, ended up reviewing this album and giving it its due. So there's a little bit of that, and I can show you here, double album set, like I said, and unlike normal sleeves, Ebullition like to do this, where their actual record covers were large-scale magazines in and of themselves, or zines. They'd print the lyrics, and they'd have a lot of these pictures. There you go. And a lot of like forewords and rambles and weird kind of poetry and this kind of stuff was very common for this label. And this is an interesting album if we're talking about its sound. Emotional hardcore had been going on for some amount of time, and it gone through somewhat of an evolution. And I think if you listen to this album in particular and this band, you can hear where what they're doing is starting to sort of look forward into the future of when the genre kind of becomes slightly more mainstream and slightly more melodic and a little bit more edging towards an alternative rock world rather than strictly a hardcore punk world. But certainly there's songs that do both. And I can't get this cover back on, so we're just going to ignore that for now. Alright, from Gravity Records out of San Diego, this is the band Klickitat Ikitawi. I just bought this from another record store in Hollywood. Orchestrated and conducted by Klickitat Ikitawi is the full name of the record. These guys were contemporaries of bands, other San Diego, chaotic, emotional hardcore, emotive hardcore. Bands like Swing Kids and Heroin, Antioch Arrow, Merrill, Iconoclast. There's a bunch of this kind of movement within the genre. Instead of going kind of slower and melodic, kind of went the other direction. It was more about being chaotic and sort of, you know, like just being as emotionally bare on stage as you can be. That's sort of where the screaming vocals come from, sort of the quote-unquote screamo sound sort of originates here in some regards, and it's less attention on sort of melodic bass lines and that kind of stuff and sort of catchy guitar riffs that was in the earlier forms, and more just towards, like, you know, running yourself into a frantic mess by the end of your 15-minute set. And, you know, some people might hear me say that and say, well, isn't that what hardcore was doing already? There's a difference. If you listen to Minor Threat, Black Flag, Dead Kennedys, Circle Jerks, whatever, if you listen to that kind of stuff, which is also short and bursting and full of noise, and then you listen to this version, they had to go through that post-hardcore thing to get to the other side of this. And while it's still fast and chaotic and direct in sort of a hardcore way, it's the moods and the frenetic energy of it is a lot less specific, I suppose. It's a little bit more sort of off-putting and a lot more sort of intense. And the guitar sound is a lot more jagged and angular. The drum is a lot more all over the place, not just your simple pit-pat sort of hardcore drumming. And almost kind of like a post-hardcore version of sort of grindcore in a way, but not as fast and limited as that either. Again, talking about this way too much. From Huntington Beach, my favorite record store in Southern California, Vinyl Solutions. These I showed in my post-hardcore video as well. This is the Bay Area sort of pop hardcore band, Sam I Am. I believe that's actually the upright way of showing the record. This is their first album, self-titled. Their second album, Soar. Soar like a bird, not like on the side of your mouth. And Billy. Colored vinyl, opaque, green, blue, and purple. These came out in 1990, 1991, 1992. And Sam I Am were a little bit more kind of in the tradition of the DC sound, you know, going back to sort of melodic bass lines, sing-along vocals, and kind of more of a gruff, introspective sort of approach to the emo sound. But there's a decent amount of sort of a pop-punk thing in there too, because, you know, we're talking about Berkeley, early 90s, Lookout Records, Gilman Street, that whole thing. You know, Green Day and Jawbreaker and Isocracy and Operation Ivy and all of those bands came out of. So there's kind of this blending of sort of the DC sound, the DC hardcore sound, and sort of the Bay Area pop punk sound. And it's sort of a beautiful mixture, in my opinion. I think they really kind of captured something there, an energy and an angst that was sort of accessible and youthful, but also kind of wrenched and meaningful in a way that can't be done through normal means of regular punk rock. They have this cool sort of DC sort of Fugazi influence in there, but you can really kind of sing along to the lyrics. Again, another band like Jawbreaker and like Sunny Day Real Estate later that would sort of look into the future of the genre when it starts to become a little bit more mainstream and it starts to become more and more sort of a pop thing and less of a hardcore thing. Again, going back in the other direction, about as far as you can go, we have the band Orchid, and they were a East Coast band. They were released on a 10-inch called Dance Tonight, Revolution Tomorrow. There's 10 tracks on here, but this is, again, like Klickitat Katawi, but even more so. I think Klickitat Katawi, considering the scene they come from and the bands that they toured with and what they're associated with Gravity Records, they're actually fairly composed and sometimes sort of more almost sort of like math rock kind of thing, and a little bit more sort of in the tradition of something like a Drive Like Jehu, whereas this band is really pushing the limits on the genre and the noise aspect of it and the chaos aspect of it, really flailing around and really playing those guitars until the strings are, breaking off the damn thing. Drums all over the place, octopus arm drumming. This really is getting damn near close to grindcore and power violence. The guitars aren't as low end and aren't as metal sounding, and the vocals are, way up here, shrieky stuff. But this is about, I think, about the most extreme the genre can get before it starts to just dissipate from the elements that I would say would have to be there to be able to classify it still as being post-hardcore or emo. But classic band, classic screamo era stuff. This came out a little bit later than a lot of this kind of stuff. By this point, the sort of Midwest sound had really kind of taken over, and it was progressively getting more and more melodic. And bands like this and Page 99 were really kind of, and nobody ever really credits them as it, but I would say bands like Dillinger Escape Plan, which sort of kind of bumps elbows a little bit with sort of this stuff. Those bands are really kind of rejecting the melodic take on the genre before it was all over by 2002. And this back and forth is actually totally unintentional, but I find it to be kind of funny now. American Football, maybe the most melodic Midwest emo band of the late 90s, early 2000s. This is their first EP that was released before their eponymous album, and it's on 3 songs on here. And if you actually look at the vinyl itself, all the songs are on one side. It's released by Polyvinyl, and I believe this is a reissue, so I can't say if this was the way it was originally released in the whenever it was, 1999, maybe 2000. But all of the songs are on one side. The other side is just kind of a gloss finish. You're not supposed to flip it over. I don't know what it would sound like if you did. Probably not good. But American Football were almost an evolution in the other way. Instead of the genre retaining sort of its hardcore sensibility, American bands like American Football and Appleseed Cast and the Gloria record and these kind of late period indie emo bands were really kind of like trying to see how pretty they could make the music. And I'm talking before your Dashboard Confessionals and all of Jimmy Worlds and that kind of stuff. Before those bands got big, the trend towards that genre in a popular way was to go more and more indie rock and less hardcore. You still have sort of the mathiness of it. I think that, the rhythm work on here and the drumming and that kind of stuff is really interesting. And certainly the guitar playing, I think, is what this band is really well known for. This kind of tappy, sort of arpeggiated stuff. That would later be called sort of twinkly guitar sound. Is what this band was sort of known for, and later influenced a ton of bands, especially more recently, in the sort of indie underground emo scene. But, these guys are great, and I think this EP is actually even better than their LP, which is, something of a legendary one-album band now. They just released a second album that's not as interesting, but, their first album, and then they broke up for something like 15 years, and they left on a high note. But yeah, if you've never listened to the EP, I definitely recommend going back and checking it out. Okay, we're at 21 minutes here on just my LPs. So you know what I think I'm going to do? I think I'm going to show my singles and 7 inches, emo 7 inches in a separate video just to break it up. So